right, hello and welcome back to track two. For our next speaker, we'll have Erika Dyck presenting on the women in the history of plant medicines. If people have been following her Chacruna series, some excellent history in there, and I've been personally enjoying reading her book, Psychedelic Psychiatry, recently. So she is a professor and a Canada Research Chair in the History of Health and Social Justice Department. She is the author of several books, including Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, Facing Eugenics, Reproduction, Sterilization, the Politics of Choice, which was shortlisted for Governor's General Award in Canadian Nonfiction, Managing Madness, the Weyburn Mental Hospital and the Transformation of Psychiatric Care in Canada, the Canadian Historical Association Prize for Best Book in Prairie History, and with Maureen Lux, Challenging Choices, Canada's Population Control in the 1970s. She's also the co-editor of Psychedelic Prophets, The Letters of Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, and A Culture's Catalyst, Historical Encounters with Peyote. Erika is the co-editor of the Canadian Bulletin for Medical History, and the co-editor of a new book series on the global history of alcohol and drugs called Intoxicating History. Erika's been doing, like as I mentioned, a lot of the Chacruna Women's Gender Diversity and Sexual Minorities Working Group, where there's hosts the series Women in the History of Psychedelic Plant Medicine. So I encourage you to check out all of those articles. I've been enjoying those a lot in the past few months. So my name is Helen Thomas. I'm a psychiatric pharmacist and researcher in unceded Ohlone land here in Oakland. And I'll be moderating the panel today. But without further ado, let's hear from our speaker, Erika. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's really wonderful to be here. And I am going to attempt to share my screen and see if this will work. Oh, and it works differently on this platform. So maybe, Helen, can you turn your microphone on and let me know if you see this properly?
Yeah, I can see it. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay. I can't see myself or any of you, but that's all right. I'm used to speaking into the void here in northern parts of the Canada. All right. Well, I'm super excited to be here and part of this incredible conversation that's been going on today and tomorrow as well. And of course, last night's opening remarks. And as Helen mentioned, I've been working on looking at the history of women in psychedelics as part of the Chacruna series. And today I'm really going to highlight some of that series for you. But I also want to talk a little bit at a kind of meta level about what doing this series has done for me and what I think some of the future is, and some of the promise for including women in this history and perhaps recalibrating some of the power dynamics from the past as we think about moving forward. So before I begin my formal part of the presentation, I want to just use this slide to acknowledge many of the people who are behind this research. And this is really in the spirit of the way I would like to try to model doing this research going forward, is recognizing so many of the people who are behind the scenes, who are helping to put things together that don't always get the same kind of name recognition and don't always get the same kind of credit. And in a spirit of changing that, I want to draw your attention to many students, undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, tech support, the funding agency. This is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada, and also some of the donations from family members who have provided support for some of the research that has made this possible. And this, of course, doesn't even get to all of the authors and all of the people who've been involved in making Chacruna work as well. But I want to acknowledge them going forward. So Bia Labache, who is no stranger to anyone here, invited me to start thinking about, the role of women in the history of psychedelics. I think it was probably 2 years ago. And, at that time, I was sort of embarrassed to admit that I had written a number of books on the topic of psychedelics, on the history of psychiatry, on all sorts of experimentation that went on. And I had not properly addressed, and I have not properly addressed or acknowledged some of the roles that women have played in the past. And so my first job, as I saw it, was to go back on my own research and look into this history deeply. And it was humbling, to say the least, to go back to listening to recorded tapes, you know, those little micro cassettes that I had done, oral interviews with people like Humphrey Osmond or Abe Hoffer, a variety of people who I interviewed in the early 2000s. And not always, but often their wives were present when we did the interviews. And always the men who I interviewed talked about their wives and talked about them, not just in a kind of a superficial sense, but their wives were so integral to the way that they made sense of the work that they were doing, both as psychiatrists, but certainly as psychedelic journeyers, as they were trying to make sense of the experiences that they had. Many of these experiences were quite vulnerable experiences, and they needed someone to trust as they went through this. And so I started sort of rethinking how I had told this history in the past. And going back to some of that early research, I wanted to think through the role that women had played in stimulating some of those early conversations. Now, of course, these aren't women who are named on published papers. The buildings aren't named after them where there are buildings. And they don't get a lot of formal recognition. So there wasn't a box of paper like these women's voices. It really is a process of stitching together a variety of ways of sort of looking into some of the stuff that's unspoken, sometimes the stuff that's between the lines, and often the stuff that ends up sort of on the cutting room floor, if you will. Those long extended parts of an interview that don't always make it into the full text when you're writing a historical narrative. But I wanted to start changing that. And I wanted to start thinking about the places that women had made important contributions that hadn't been seen as critical to moving a narrative forward, either in the research enterprise or also in the way that we have historicized women's accomplishments in the past. Of course, people have started asking these questions in other venues, and I point to MAP Special Edition that Bia had worked on. Also, of course, the Women in Psychedelics Forum and the work that Chacruna is doing. I am certainly not alone in recognizing these challenges. But about a year ago, we launched the Chacruna Women in the History of Psychedelics series, and we have wonderful editorial support from Jessica DeWitt, who is an incredibly keen astute editor, but also someone who recognizes the importance of social media optimizing and is really great at helping us to sort of punch above our weight in some respects or help us to reach new audiences. And Patrick Farrell, who has been an absolute dream to work with. He's an editor who has combed through lots and lots of pages of feminist literature, feminist philosophy, and thinking about the place of women in science. And so together, we've started to try to make a call for all of these different stories about women in the history of psychedelics. And some of these you have read. I won't belabor that, but I will point out a few that I think are really critical. Now, at first, what we wanted to do was simply sort of put the call out and see what would happen. Find out, you know, what kinds of stories might we be able to share? Is this a point? Is this an opportunity to sort of address some of the imbalance that we've seen in the historical narrative, draw in some of those women, some of whom we know about, Maria Sabina, for example, Valentina Wasson, for example. Could we draw in those stories to sort of recalibrate the narrative? Or was this an opportunity to sort of delve deeper and understand not just the place of women, but what women represent in terms of a diversity of perspectives in the psychedelic past as a way to point to a psychedelic future that might be more inclusive? And that's become our goal. Even if we had that goal at the outset, we weren't maybe confident enough that we may be able to reach that. But I'm so pleased with the results that we're getting that I am now confident that this is part of the story, part of the work that we're doing with this series. This was the landing page as I took the screenshot just a couple of days ago. So up until today, you can see all of these and more. Our goal, and for anyone who's listening who's got an idea for a post, please reach out. Our goal is to reach 50 posts and to be able to do that continuously. And I think we're getting close to 40 now. I should have counted them this morning, but I didn't. I was too busy listening to presentations. In these posts, you can see a diversity of ways that women have participated in this history, but you can also see a diversity of ways that authors are engaging with this topic. And that's the thing that I am most proud of. We are seeing here an opportunity to showcase different ways that scholars, activists, community members are beginning to think about and talk about and sometimes argue about the role of women or the importance of paying attention to things like gender and diversity in both the past and the future. Let me give you a couple of examples. Amy Bartlett and Monica Williams, again, probably no strangers to anyone here, have written about Valentina Wasson and the importance of getting our stories right. What they remind us is that often we think about, Maria Sabina and a relationship with Gordon Wasson, but as we comb through even the published literature, even the material that was available on at Life magazine at the time, we see that Valentina or Tina Pavlovna Wasson was actually probably the reason why Maria Sabina actually met up with Gordon at all. After all, it was Dr. Valentina Wasson who had the ethnobotany degree and who had the research credentials to move through those spaces. And not to mention the connection that these two women had upon meeting, sharing knowledge, but also sharing certain experiences. I'm going to give you a few more highlights. Probably the highlight for me was doing interviews with the Osmond children to profile their mother, a woman who had always been sort of part of my understanding of this history, as she was so clearly present in Humphrey Osmond's writings, particularly the letters that he wrote to his friends, not simply the published stuff, but the letters. And interviewing their children did fairly recently. Amazing to really help to anchor my understanding of Jane's influence and the depth of her influence. One of the things that their daughter, Fee, who's imaged here, or sorry, that's their son, Julian there. I don't have a picture of Fee. She provided the images though. What Euphemia or Fee Blackburn shared with me was that she doesn't think her father, Humphrey Osmond, the man who coined psychedelics, she doesn't think he could have done anything that he would have done without her mother's support. That she was a soundboard, she was a listener, she was a skilled nurse who not only practiced nursing outside the home, but ended up nursing a lot of the patients, and in fact, Humphrey Osmond himself on his many self-experimentations in their kitchen. I'm working on a project to bring this story to life through a graphic novel, and I'm really pleased with the ways that we have tried to bring some of these principles to bear in the retelling of this history, in capturing this narrative with attention to the way that women, sometimes quietly and sometimes in unobserved ways, participated in helping their husbands, in this case, integrate, helping them to cope, helping them to think through and reflect on the kinds of research that they were doing. Here's just one example. A woman who I haven't been able to draw enough attention to yet, and I hope to correct this, is Amy Azumi. She was the wife of an architect, Kiyoshi Izumi, who narrowly escaped being interned in the Japanese internment camps that occurred in the United States and in Canada during World War II. He came and hid out in Regina, where the government did a quick cost-benefit analysis and determined that it wasn't worth their while to intern Japanese Canadians living in that region because there weren't enough of them. Amy met her husband because her father took him in, and Kiyoshi Izumi went on to make all sorts of architectural design reforms by taking LSD and wandering through hospitals to determine sort of the effects that this had on his interpretation of space. But Amy was his constant support. She did not have an enjoyable experience. She described becoming nauseous, but it was she who helped him think through his designs. And it was she who literally in the arms of her family protected him from internment as he created this protected space where he later did his work. Jane and Duncan Blewett are another example. Jane was a PhD student in psychology, and Duncan was a professor of psychology. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions there about how they met. But they soon wed and had about a 40-year marriage. And June was absolutely critical in helping Duncan bring lobbies to Parliament. Duncan was a fierce supporter of not only Indigenous rights for access to peyote in Canada, where it doesn't grow, so to preserve and help secure the rights for the Native American Church of Canada chapters to retain their peyote supplies. Duncan Blewett tirelessly lobbied the federal government, but it was June who actually distributed all the letters. It was June who looked up all of the MPs' addresses, and it was June who was really behind the sort of organization of that. And I point to these stories just as small little samples of my own research that I had collected almost 20 years ago and I had overlooked. And I want to take ownership of that and move this forward by recalibrating this balance in my own work. But the part that I'm most excited about is the place of new scholars who are integrating this research now seamlessly and drawing their own conclusions about the ways in which women have participated in this past and the way that it's changing the way that they're writing their histories. Andrea Enns is a classic example. She has written both about Maria Huxley and Laura Huxley, so Aldous Huxley's two wives. Very different women, and yet both very critical for Aldous Huxley's understanding of the world and his connections to it at different times in his life. So Maria Huxley was described as a little bit more, a little quieter, a little bit more, sometimes described as a more typical kind of housewife, although I don't think that's a fair assessment by any respect. Andrea will correct us on that. But Andrea draws our attention to the way that Maria actually engaged with psychedelics on her own. Not individually, but I mean her own individual experiences. One of the things that Maria did, which really pushed Aldous Huxley in directions that we now have all benefited from, is to get him to think about psychic energy, to think about parapsychology. And it was Maria's deep connections with women who worked in this field and women who played with ideas of spirituality and consciousness. It was she who convened those dinner parties and brought these women in, who infused and influenced Aldous Huxley's impressions of some of his ideas about spirituality and psychic energy. Zoe Dubois, some of you may know Zoe. She is a formidable force. She is one of the co-founders of the Psychedelic Society in France, and she has been doing incredible research looking at the way that women in France were connected, not only in a linguistic network, but also reaching beyond the French language and looking to a whole host of women who kind of quietly and sometimes in almost secretive ways coveted some of their own ways of adjusting set and setting to improve outcomes among patients that they were exploring. She shows how women were connected throughout Europe through different chains of women's networks. They sometimes met at conferences attending with their husbands, and yet went and met. They didn't really, how shall I put this? I'll try to be polite about it. They weren't paying attention to what their husbands were doing. Instead, the women were driven by meeting with other women and sharing some of the very intimate ideas about approaching things around set and setting. This was even before the concept of set and setting was codified as set and setting, but they very quickly recognized the importance of having someone to hold your hand, the importance of touch, of safe touch in this environment, of music, of fresh flowers. It was the women who were starting to think about this and already articulating it well in advance of the moments that we think of it as having this codified. What Zoe tells us is that she focuses on 3 women. You can go and check out her paper if you like. But these women developed a therapeutic approach with their patients that was comprehensive, benevolent, and non-intrusive. And this was radical. It not only broke with traditional methods, but it was radical at the time for these women to break apart from even the men who were engaging in psychedelic research at the time. I promised I would keep track of my time here. Patrick Barber, who is the author of Psychedelic Revolutionaries, has explored the way that Eileen Garrett brought this, her psychic experiences to the psychedelic enterprise. And his post is really wonderful, but I since learned that Eileen Garrett was actually the godmother of one of the Osmond children. And I hadn't appreciated that these familial networks were deep, these kinship ties ran deep, not only among the investigators, but people like Eileen Garrett and Jane Osmond, who retained a strong friendship throughout their lives and remained connected in ways that facilitated those relationships with their husbands that then influenced their work. What Patrick tells us about Eileen Garrett is that she was reputed to be the greatest psychic and trance medium of the 20th century. Lesser known is her role as one of the unsung women influencers behind the golden age of psychedelic science. Working with some of the leading psychedelic researchers of the 1950s and 60s, Garrett was a pivotal force, a pivotal guiding force. I am so pleased to see these kinds of impressions and this kinds of research now coming out in the new history books on the psychedelic science. I want to pause for a moment and talk about Steve Lett's research. Steve Lett is a musicologist, and he's working as a postdoc at the University of Saskatchewan. And although we haven't been able to hang out on campus together, we've really had an opportunity to get to know each other and learn each other's languages as I attempt to learn something about musicology. What Steve has taught me is that musicology was a field and music therapy was a field that was already dominated by ideas about gender and music. And when these ideas about the gendering of music, or the way that music could be used differently by different music therapists to elicit different kinds of emotions, and that theorizing was taking place by a variety of really radical women, I'll call them radical, by amazing women who are taking music into new territories in terms of the musicology literature. What he shows is that they took those impulses and brought them into the psychedelic therapy sessions. Really, when we think about the role of music in those therapy sessions, there's been lots written about this, and we probably all know that the soundscapes can make a really big difference to the experiences. And what Steve has been showing is that a variety of women broke from the so-called father of musicology to devise a more sensitive, emotionally attuned way of using music in therapy sessions, particularly in psychedelic therapy sessions. We think of Helen Bonny in this role, but he shows that there are other women, Hermina Browne, for example, music into its emotional constituent parts and use that to frame up set and setting. And we still use some of those characteristics today. He says that Bonny was convinced by the power of emotional experience as the transformative and healing intervention. And it was through her theorizing that we began to think about this. I'm almost done with my review here of papers that you may have already seen, but I'm very excited and I want to draw attention to these wonderful new authors. Naomi Rendina is a recent PhD graduate in the United States who has been writing about one of the risks to revealing this kind of knowledge. And I think it's a really interesting corrective, or a really interesting perspective on why don't we know this history? Why don't we know about the history of women in the history of psychedelic plant medicines? And what Naomi tells us and reminds us, along with other authors like Nora Jaffrey and Alessio Tarsia, is that some of this knowledge was not only sacred, but was also very risky to share, particularly when plant knowledge intersected with reproductive justice or reproductive knowledge. Seeking abortions, for example, and seeking plant remedies for abortions had to conceal that information. And she describes how there's a vast history and a deep history of women's whispered networks of botanical knowledge that was used to protect women and to protect women's rights, and that we shouldn't tamper with that legacy, that there is a real importance to being able to protect this space. And what I've learned from Nancy Turner, ethnobotanist who's also profiled on these in the series, is that this also links up with certain principles around protecting Indigenous knowledge around plant knowledge. It's not just sort of drawing attention to the fact that there is Indigenous knowledge, which of course we all know, but that there are reasons why this knowledge has been protected. There are reasons why it is not made completely open access or completely open. And Nancy Turner and Naomi remind us of some of the real risks of the bodily harms that have occurred as a result of sharing this knowledge freely. Naomi says that the use of plant-based medicines became part of women's networks of knowledge, often concealed, protected, and quite possibly subject to lots of inconsistent use as desperate women sought solutions that could be kept secret. So I want to end this and open it up for questions. And I think, you know, as excited as I was about doing this series for all sorts of reasons that might have seemed straightforward in the first place, I've really learned so much from the way that a diversity of voices, a diversity of women's voices, but even thinking about the ways that women have participated in diverse ways has opened up a variety of conversations that I'm really excited about. I think it's so critical to the movement, to moving psychedelics forward, that we have to have a diversity both in the way we understand this past, but also as we build a diverse future going forward. We know, and we heard in Sarah Reed's talk earlier today, that having that diversity of therapists, having a diversity of faces, having a diversity of voices in this movement is critical to its success, and critical to making sure that we calibrate some of the sensitive issues carefully and we don't make some of the mistakes of the past. So as a historian, I will just say that for my part, I want to make sure that we also don't caricature the past and don't pretend that some of these people didn't exist, or that these movements weren't also aligned with some of the same principles we have today. And I welcome your feedback, your questions, and I hope that many of you feel like you have stories that you want to tell and you want to share, and be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that excellent presentation. So yeah, this series has been so fascinating because I remember when I was growing up, one of my favorite books on Huxley's This Time Was, and so I was wondering if you could talk about, yeah, just the dynamics of how you saw the families interplay with the Huxleys and the Osmond family. Like, what are some of the interesting aspects of that from your reading and doing interviews and things?
Yeah, it's amazing. I feel like I'm sort of starting all over again in some respects. I started this research 20 years ago, and I thought I had ideas, and then the more I think about it, the more I want to undo some of those ideas and start again. Not to sort of throw everything away, but there were certain things that I didn't pay attention to initially, and I'm really beginning to appreciate sorts of diverse ways that families connected. I'll give you an example. Humphrey Osmond was, super nervous about driving to Beverly Hills. The Huxleys, in this case, Maria and Aldous. And by the end of that first meeting, they've already become fast friends. And very, very quickly, Aldous Huxley describes Humphrey Osmond as someone who was like a son to them and also a grandfather. And the letters become intertwined. So Maria and Aldous are writing. Now, Maria's literally typing the letters because Aldous' eyesight is failing. And so she's very much a part of the expression that they're communicating. And Jane is always referenced in the letters. And I suspect also sitting with him at times as they write these letters. And you begin to see how these families connect across generations, across physical space, using different kinds of ways of talking. And yet, they're both British. So there's that. But and they become very, they it's amazing how well these folks are able to network at a time when, here we are participating in a virtual conference where we can, zoom in, and I'm complaining about my screen not working, but the cost of phoning each other was so prohibitive that they wrote letters almost every week. And we are fortunate letters and to be able to mine them for this kind of intimate detail about how they thought about each other and how they thought about these growing networks of people and the kinds of influences they sought.
Yeah, that those letters that's quite something to piece together and get a real sense of those connections and relationships as it's emerging. So we got some questions from the audience. What kind of sensibility do you feel that has been brought to the field by psychedelics by women?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is simplistic almost, and it sounds overly simplistic, but it's amazing. And maybe it's because I read a lot of stuff from the 1950s, and so some of the language is a little bit more blunt. But the notion of being able to hold someone's hand through a therapy session. There were nurses present, and female nurses. This was, again, the 1950s. But some of these things, as they get sort of standardized in practice and as they get placed in protocols and get described and codified, we begin to see some of the subtle ways in which women are engaged in changing the experiences for patients or subjects. And it's in reading the subject reports or those patient reports, and I'm using those words because some people are volunteers and some people are voluntary, but they're there for under a diagnosis. It's in those moments that I almost invariably see reference to subtle, small things that we might not think of as being that critical when you're designing a trial or you're designing a space. You might not think at 10:04, make sure that someone is at hand with a warm hand, not a cold hand, or that someone has a warm drink. Some of these little things that, we're attuned to by people who had a lot of experience as nurses, or people who had a lot of experience just caregiving, sometimes unpaid kind of caregiving. And those are often women. And it's the women who get cited in the patient's reports. I couldn't have gone through this, but that woman, sometimes unnamed, held my hand and helped me find myself. or helped bring me back into my body. And it's those subtleties that I think, you know, sometimes had been written out of the final reports. It's like, this was the dose we used. This was, you know, this was the amount of time we had, or this is the diagnosis we attuned to things to. And what we're finding is that, you know, in the subjective reports, people want to talk about the smell of the flowers or the choice of the flowers, and they can't even remember the dose. And so some of those things I think are worth paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. Then another question here. This actually came up during the Healing Science Ayahuasca panel earlier. Question about, I'd like to know more about your view on the role of menstruation in work with medicines. Women are often excluded, for example, from ayahuasca ceremonies while menstruating. Any thoughts on this or anything you come across?
I don't. I mean, I would ask Naomi or Nora, two of the authors who've written specifically about women's botanical knowledge around menstruation and around reproduction in general, because I think there is an interesting space here. One where we see sometimes women's knowledge that they don't want to share, and for reasons usually of birth control reasons, where it's illegal or frowned upon, even if it is legal sometimes. I conversation to the particular ayahuasca ceremonies. I know that historically there were some, even in the peyote ceremonies, women were often sort of excluded from those ceremonies, at least in the ones that I've looked at, when they were menstruating as well. And so I do think that there's something to be said there, and I'm not the one to say it. I don't know, but I would love if somebody's got research on this, to explore that more, because I think, you know, it's a fascinating area that kind of begins to overlap over these areas of where women sort of have protected some of that knowledge or concealed that knowledge, and also where they've been shunned for acts of reproduction.
Yeah, so another somewhat related question is, what is your perspective on the possibility of women with postpartum depression using psychedelics as a form of treatment?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I know in the historical literature, I mean, so postpartum depression wasn't sort of coined as a specific disorder, although, you know, it doesn't take too much to sort of piece together symptoms that might have been clustered in that way or might have been understood as something like that. You know, there's the 1950s are a fascinating time for studying the history of psychiatry, because they've got a really sort of lopsided sense of things in terms of there being many male decision makers either coming up with those categories of illness and also their treatments. And you see also a disproportionate sort of women who are suffering or seeking treatments, and there's a lot of different power dynamics at play there, both in terms of patient doctor, but also in terms of gender. And I think this is something going forward that would be worth exploring at a deeper level. I don't know what the research is today, but I would be surprised if this isn't on the table.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, it seems like a logical thing. So another question asking for, what are some of your favorite female writers for books about sacred plants?
Well, I have to say, I recently did an interview with Nancy Turner, and I think I'm a fan now, a fangirl. She's just an incredible person, has an incredible story, an incredible way of sort of empowering people as she goes in her very sort of humble, modest approach. For anyone who doesn't know, she's done incredible work working with the Pacific Northwest, Indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest, in working with linguists and elders and students, and trying to help reclaim language, but also language specific to naming of plants. So creating really incredibly rich and detailed compendiums of plant knowledge in the Pacific Northwest. And she's somebody who I felt incredibly inspired by, meeting with her and profiling her as part of this series. I would run out and get her stuff as one. Laura Huxley, as you mentioned, is, you know, incredible, gifted. She's got her own vision of the world. She is not a mirror of her husband by any stretch whatsoever, and yet is tethered in some ways to that rich legacy as well, and is certainly influenced by his work. But certainly has her own voice and is worth reading.
Yeah.
I could think of others. Simone de Beauvoir, fascinating. Patrick Farrell wrote a post about Simone de Beauvoir and her willingness to sort of take Jean-Paul Sartre by the hand through his own mescaline experience and then help him for the rest of his life, I think, integrate that experience. And her very sort of stoic writings about this at times, she's not only is incredible in her own right, but the way that she has sort of helped him to make sense of those crabs that followed him in his mescaline experience is fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question here is, have women and men described psychedelic experiences similarly in terms of visual experiences, feelings, etc.?
It's a great question. I have been, over the past few years, working with that team of students that I listed or identified at the beginning. We've been digitizing, I guess we call them sort of naive trip reports, but these were all through clinical trials, or at least related to clinical trials. Some of the trials took place in people's homes, but they were conducted loosely around the at least the 1950s ethics of doing is digitizing that, and then what we want to do and what we hope to do is link it with a few different sites to start measuring asking those kinds of questions. We want to compare how things worked, for example, at Spring Grove Hospital. What kind of music were they playing? Did they get similar results? How did the gender dimensions play out? What we're finding, this is early 1950s through to about the mid 1970s in most cases. And what we've got are, people who've suffered trauma. Holocaust survivors, for example, are some of the people who we are finding, it wasn't a study of Holocaust survivors, but people who were Holocaust survivors participated in these trials. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to amass enough data from this historical period that we can start asking some of those questions in ways that go beyond some of the anecdotal evidence that we've had so far, but in a more systematized way. I'm really excited about that, but I don't have the answers yet. I will say that there were real consequences to identifying with certain kinds of conditions. In many jurisdictions throughout this period, it's illegal for women to drink in public. So, not very many women admitted to being alcoholics. There were real serious consequences, legal consequences, not to mention any health consequences. But women were more readily self-identifying or sort of using the kind of language that would lend itself to sounding depressed, and then you drink for depression, and then it's not that the patients are relating the diagnosis, but there's a dynamic interaction there, of course, between the psychiatrist and the patients. And it's not always clear that it's a gendered expression or an expression that conforms to the expectations of the setting. Either this is the way you're supposed to talk to a doctor, or this is the way a woman is supposed to behave. And I think that sometimes gets in the way of understanding a more authentic expression of, this is how I really felt, as opposed to this is what I need to say.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So the question actually kind of ties in with this of someone asking about how to deepen their knowledge on music therapy and plant medicine, and any resources or literature you could recommend. I know you mentioned Helen Bonny. If you could tell people a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm learning about Helen Bonny primarily through Steve Lett, who I hope will publish his work as well. He's written a dissertation on Helen Bonny and on the kind of music therapy. And as I understand it, his work goes deeper into how music therapy was theorizing at the time. So how do we think about therapy? How do we think about the relationships? What he was describing to me that I find fascinating is that there were sort of two schools at the time, if you will. One was that we should use music to create a familiarity in the setting. So you imagine coming into a clinical trial setting, this is a psychedelic trial, you know that you're going to receive a dose of something, whether it's psilocybin, mescaline, or LSD. Those are the three main ones that we've seen used at this time. And you know that it's going to take a little while for it to take effect or for you to feel any effects. And so what they were doing is putting music on at the beginning that people recognized to just sort of distract them. But what people like Bonny and people like Hermina Browne were saying were arguing was that it wasn't enough to make someone feel comfortable or relaxed, but you wanted to use the music to actually elicit emotional reactions. And so you might familiarize them at the beginning, but you move away from the classics. You move away from Beethoven. Well, no one liked Beethoven in these moments. It was too somber. But you use music that people recognize enough that they can anticipate, but it also distracts them from themselves. And they write beautifully about the way you can use soundscapes to explore and evoke emotion, to calibrate those. Mendel Kaelin, of course, has been writing about this in the contemporary setting, and I think he's done some incredible work thinking about that, but also sort of exploring how we might predict that emotion and sound maybe even beyond music. And I'm at the edge of my understanding of how music is made to say that comment. But yeah, I hope to be able to point to other things as I keep learning more about this. But it's a really fascinating area, and it's an area that's dominated by women as music therapists. So.
Mm-hmm. So another question, have you come across any gender queer figures in Western psychedelic history?
This is a question that I've explored to some degree, but really I can put her in write her name here if others want. What Andrea's done is gone through a series of files from the Hollywood Hospital, which was a private hospital in Vancouver, in Canada. And what she has found, it's fascinating because on the one hand, I haven't found any therapists who identify as queer in any 1950s language or anything. But what we do find are that there are sometimes patients who came into clinics for something. Some of them are describing they're asked to describe why they think psychedelics will help them. This is one of the questions on the sort of pre-screening. And some of the patients come in saying, I think I drink too much, or I can't get out of bed. Some things that we might think is, you can kind of anticipate where that's going. But by the end of the experience, so this is usually over 2 days, what they describe is, I think I can't get out of bed. This would be a man talking, because I'm not in love with my wife. I love men. And there are these moments where, they come in with a diagnosis, or they have to have a diagnosis in order to qualify for these experiments or these trials. I'm mixing words because it depends on the jurisdiction. But what happens is, in that moment, there's an exploration of sexuality. And that's where we're seeing some of these things coming up. And what I'm also finding is that, until, and it's late until the end of the 1970s, that the DSM still has homosexuality listed as a disease. And there are jurisdictions in United States and Canada where it's also considered a criminal offense. I mean, it's interesting that those elements don't seem to play out in the psychedelic encounter. So when people come in and explore their sexuality in the psychedelic encounter, I'm not seeing a lot of moralizing in the Hollywood files. Now, I know that there are also other jurisdictions and other places where there has been secondary literature to suggest. There's another place in Ontario, in Penetanguishene, where they were specifically using LSD as more related to conversion therapy, using it as a punishment. But this was also done without adhering to set and setting. This was strapping people to beds and whatnot. So it's a complicated space for exploring this, I think, because there's not a lot of trust to divulge questions about sexuality in a space that is heavily criminalized and medicalized at this time. And yet, in some of those encounters where people presumably feel safe, what we see are quite positive results. And it may not be surprising that the results are positive, I think, because people talk about how they were able to gain insight of themselves and how they learned to love themselves, how they felt whole again, the kind of language that we might think of as making people feel better, that could be some benefit. But I haven't compared those with the Penetanguishene results, for example, and I'm sure that there are other examples. But I think those are where the trial is designed to look for some kind of sexual expression, particularly one that's considered deviant at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So fun, interesting question here. Since Bicycle Day just passed, someone was wondering if the assistant for Bicycle Day was a woman or a man, because
I'm
there's
pretty sure it was a
conflicting
woman. I
stories.
mean, in Albert Hoffman's review of this, I'm pretty sure it's a woman. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, there are kind of women dotted through that story, right? I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
his neighbor and his wife, and there are all these women who are kind of like looking out for him. And I shouldn't just do this by reading cartoons, but the images that we get sometimes from that story, and I know it's been caricatured to death, but he seems a bit disheveled. And like he can't actually maybe manage on his own. And so there's a variety of women who kind of like help him along, not only through his Bicycle Day experience, but also for the next set of decades as he continues to integrate that experience and think about what it means.
Yep. Another question there.
I see her chat. Of course, she knows the person's name. Susie Ramstein, thank you.
There you go. Another question, there's lots of discussion about preserving indigenous tradition and science needs to understand, but are there any thoughts about leaving space for the women intuitive practices of healing as well?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And my concern this series was, I think it's really important to profile the women, but also I was like, but it's not just about women. And never was that my intention that it's, if only women did psychedelics, the world would be a better place. I think this really is a way of thinking about diversity. One of the things that I've come to appreciate as I've been trying to find authors and trying to find people to participate in this is that there's lingering reticence, certainly within the community that I live in. I'm on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis. There's not a lot of interest right now, at least in my local community, of really sharing that sacred knowledge. There's the distrust, the mistrust is deep, and I think it's something that we need to be cautious about. I think we need to take things slowly. I mean, I'm not going to just drive to the nearest indigenous reserve and say like we should be doing, even though I know that there are people at a nearby reserve where there are peyote ceremonies, and I know there are chapters that existed historically, but there are some tender relationships that need to be rebuilt before we can claim that, claim this past. I think it has to be done really respectfully and really carefully. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I'm really interested in seeing where this goes forward and making sure that we hold space and create space for people to come on their own terms, when they want to share that knowledge, if they want to share that knowledge, and under what conditions. And I am certain that there are women who are holding that knowledge as well.
Yeah. Someone had a question on the idea of doing research on the use of psychedelics and pedagogy and parenting, motherhood, especially with child rearing, sort of developmental. Any thoughts on that?
There's a woman named Loretta Bender who did a number of studies using mostly LSD, I think, and psilocybin. I know LSD for sure, on around autism, and she did a number of these studies historically, looking at parenting, but mothering in particular, and looking at children with at that time it was a blunt instrument, but talking about an autism spectrum. And I think there's more work to be done there in terms of both recovering that history, because it's been sort of pushed to the side, perhaps because it was a study that was led by a woman, but also it was a study that doesn't look favorably necessarily on the psychedelic community. And I think we need to sort of reconcile that, and we need to think about, some of the stories that are not so favorable and not sort of hide them away, but think about how we tell those stories and how we bring them into this conversation, because they're important too. And I think there are lessons to be taken there. I don't know enough about Loretta Bender's specific approach to autism, but there is a PhD student at Toronto working on this, and I'm excited. Andrew Jones, watch for his work. There's a study coming from him on this very topic. So I hope that we will learn more. And I'll just use that to say again that I'm really excited by the conversations that are happening, the diverse conversations that are happening, that are asking these questions and rethinking not just the history, but how we use that history to inform how we're thinking about doing things today, or the sort of pitfalls that we might try to avoid. People, I don't think, are shying away from some of these stories as they were even when I was doing thousands.
Well, great. That wraps up the panel for today. Thank you so much for your talk. It was excellent as always, and enjoyed hearing more about these stories. The stories are important. It adds so much richness into understanding the knowledge that has been built during this time. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.